Hey guys, today we are going to be reading chapters 31 through 33 in Serafina and the Splintered Heart, and we are reading this with the permission of the author and the publishers. Chapter 31. As Serafina entered Biltmore's main hall, it was thick with the aroma of burning candles, fine clean wool, and women's perfumes, all mixed together with the scent of the thousands of roses and lilies that had been strung along the archways and beams of the house. The genteel murmur of the guests' voices mixed with the sounds of rustling satin, pouring wine, and tinkling glasses. There were so many people in the room from wall to wall that the arms of strangers touched each other where they stood, and friends leaned to one another to say a private word. But all the guests seemed happy and respectful, honored to be a part of the grand festivities. Serafina scanned the crowd, but did not see Rowena or Braden. The gentlemen at the ball wore formal evening attire, dark tailcoats and trousers, neatly pressed white shirts with wing collars, dark waistcoats, and white bow ties or cravats. Some of the men were lean, others heavy, some with long handlebar mustaches or neatly trimmed beards, others clean-shaven. They all wore white gloves on their hands, and many had watches in their pockets with long dangling gold or silver chains. A few even had silver-topped canes or formal walking staffs, but none were twisted. What struck Serafina most was just how pleased the men were to see each other, to be talking and drinking, laughing and carrying on like a great, gregarious flock of black and white jays cawing at each other, with no idea that a young boy of their rank had buried a body nearby and that the fading lost spirit of a dead girl walked among them. The ladies wore long, full, shimmering dancing gowns made from satin, taffeta, and many other fine and luxurious materials, in dark purples, strawberry creams, peach chiffon, lilac, and blue, an endless variety of colors that reminded Serafina of the summer's blooms. She peered suspiciously at each of the women and girls in the crowd, searching for a girl that looked like her. She had a hunch that the sorceress would be hiding in there someplace among the others, for deceit was her specialty. Serafina watched the sometimes slow, sometimes flighty interactions between the young ladies and the young gentlemen. Many of the ladies and older girls held embroidered fans, opening or fluttering them to signal interest to a possible suitor, closing or snapping them shut to signal disdain. As she studied the young ladies and gentlemen maneuvering and interacting with one another, it reminded her of the sandhill cranes that sometimes stopped on their migration to practice their mating dance in the spring fields, hopping and raising their wings, dipping their heads, and tossing sticks to one another, spinning or chortling with abandon. She didn't know exactly why the cranes and the young ladies went through all of that or what it all meant, but she sensed that it was some hidden language all its own. The younger children, who weren't yet cranes, gathered in small groups together, whispering and watching all the various proceedings in the room. Gaggles of giggling girls pulled each other excitedly through the crowds towards unseen adventures. Clutches of young boys gathered near the food tables. Among the adults, the room was full of society types and fashion plates, industrialists and politicians, authors and artists, ambassadors and dignitaries of a nature that Serafina did not understand. She missed her old friend, the smiling, storytelling Mr. Olmsted, who had returned to his home far away. As Serafina made her way into the room, the soft, lovely sound of harps and violins began to fill the hall, and then the deep sound of cellos and other instruments joined in. Row upon row of musicians, each one in black coat and tie, were arranged in the center of the main hall, playing the most beautiful, sweeping, romantic music she had ever heard. Mr. Vanderbilt hadn't just arranged for a soloist or a string quartet. He had brought an entire orchestra into his home. Serafina remembered years before, when she was but a little child, sneaking around the house late at night. Mr. Vanderbilt's friend, Thomas Edison, had given him a music-playing phonograph with a crank handle and a large brass horn. She had often watched the master of the house sitting alone in his library listening to his opera music. Mr. Vanderbilt loved Tannhauser so much that he commissioned the famous sculptor Mr. Carl Bitter to depict an epic scene from the opera in the frieze above the banquet hall's gigantic triple fireplace. She remembered that Edison's music machine had produced a scratchy, tinny sound that she hadn't liked, but this live orchestra was something else entirely. Mr. Vanderbilt had traveled all over Europe collecting art and furniture for Biltmore, but also attending concerts and operas, and now she understood why. She could finally see and hear what he loved so much. All the musicians were playing together in such perfect harmony, with all the violins and cellos and other instruments sweeping into gorgeous waves of sound, like nothing she had ever heard before. She overheard a gentleman say to one of the other guests that the music was from a new ballet called Swan Lake, which Mr. Vanderbilt had heard in Europe and fallen in love with, so he'd arranged for the orchestra to play it tonight. The rising music carried through Biltmore's soaring archways to all the grand rooms of the house, to all the elegant ladies in their glimmering dresses and the handsome gentlemen in their evening coats. There were flutes that made the sound of thrushes in the morning, and reedy oboes that sounded like the little grebes that landed in the lagoon in the fall, and majestic French horns like coming kings, instruments of so many kinds that she couldn't name them all. That was when she finally spotted Braden. She felt a flush of happiness that her friend was all right. Rowena was nowhere to be seen, and Braden was safe. Perhaps the night was going to turn out better than she'd feared. Braden made his way through the crowd up to his aunt and uncle. He was wearing black tails, a white tie, and white gloves. He looked every bit the well-to-do young gentleman. "You look very handsome, young man," Mrs. Vanderbilt said cheerfully. "Thank you," Braden said, blushing a little. "You seem more chipper today," Mr. Vanderbilt remarked. "I'm feeling a little better," Braden agreed. "Well," Mrs. Vanderbilt said, "I know several little ladies who are reserving a spot on the dance card for you." Braden's mood darkened. "I would rather not." "I know your heart's not in it, Braden," Mrs. Vanderbilt said gently. "But when the dancing begins, it would be ungentleman if you didn't ask some of the girls to dance with you. Many of them have come a long way to be here with us." "I understand," Braden said glumly. "Does your leg feel all right?" Mrs. Vanderbilt asked compassionately. "Do you feel well enough to dance?" "It's not that. Braden began, but then faltered. Serafina could see that he didn't want to lie to his aunt, but he didn't want to tell her what she didn't want to hear either. "I know she was a good friend," his aunt said, "but eventually, for your own sake, you're going to have to accept that she's gone." "I know," Braden said sadly. "I'm not gone yet, Braden!" Serafina cried out, despite herself, forgetting her mature and somber acceptance of her death just a few minutes before. "Don't let go of me! Hold on to me!" But of course, no one could hear her. In the next moment, the conductor of the orchestra brought the evening's musical prelude to an end. Everyone clapped politely, and then he tapped 3 times on his stand and lifted his white baton. An excited murmur ran through the crowd. They knew what was coming. The sound of the orchestra rose up into a lively and sweeping waltz, perfect for dancing. Little bouts of enthused clapping rose up among the guests, everyone happy that the time had finally come. Gentlemen, young and old, throughout the ball walked over to the ladies of their choice, bowed deeply, took their hands, and asked them to dance. The palm trees, furniture, and work of arts that normally filled the winter garden had been cleared away to make room for dancing. And while many of the mansion's rooms and corridors were lit with candles, the finely carved beams above the dance floor were strung with thousands of tiny electric lights, like fireflies in a magic garden, so that the ladies' dresses glowed and shimmered in the light. "So that's what Pa had been working on," Serafina thought, and at that moment she caught her breath, for her Pa was standing across the room from her in a handsome dark suit, leaning against one of the black marble columns of the winter garden. He was not in the formal white-tie evening wear of the Biltmores' guests, but he was washed and shaved, and he looked more handsome and dignified than she had ever seen him before. He was gazing at the lights that he'd put up for the ball and listening to the pleased reactions of the delighted couples as they walked out onto the dance floor. There was a proud and satisfied look on his face, and all the emotion that she'd been feeling moments before welled up inside of her. She wanted to go over to him, to hug him, and tell him how proud she was of him and how much she loved him. Her Pa had never been to school and knew no magic spells, but tonight he was the Wizard of Light. As the elegant couples began filling the dance floor, Serafina noticed a girl standing across the room. She was dressed in a long, beautiful, dark green iridescent gown. The girl had severely angled cheekbones, long black hair, and large amber eyes. The hackles on the back of Serafina's neck went straight up. "There she is," Serafina thought. Rowena's face possessed a disturbing resemblance to her own, but it was different from her too, like a more alluring, better version of herself. It appeared that Rowena wasn't pretending to be her, but an older sister or a cousin. She must have stolen or used some sort of spell to create the dress, and she had fixed her long black hair up into an elaborate arrangement. To Serafina, she looked magnificent and beautiful, and evil all at once. Rowena was almost perfect in her appearance, but when Serafina looked more closely, she saw at the edge of her high collar the trace of the terrible scar on Rowena's pale white skin. Determined to stop the sorceress before she started, Serafina walked straight toward her. But even as Serafina charged forward, what she heard behind her made her heart sink. "All right," Braden said softly to his aunt, and he noticed the mysterious but strangely familiar black-haired girl in the green gown. "I'll ask her to dance." "That's excellent. Thank you, Braden," Mrs. Vanderbilt said, barely noticing the girl, but immensely encouraged by her nephew's sudden willingness to do his gentlemanly duty for at least one of the young ladies in the room. "Do we know that girl?" Mr. Vanderbilt asked, eyeing Rowena with concern. "I'm sure she's from a good family," Mrs. Vanderbilt said, obviously pleased that Braden was finally beginning to socialize. As Braden moved towards the girl to ask her to dance, Serafina moved towards her as well. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. "Skedaddle, kitty cat, I've got work to do," Rowena whispered beneath her breath, and then lifted her face and smiled a gracious smile as Braden presented himself to her, bowed, and offered his white-gloved hand. To those around them who happened to be watching, none of this seemed out of the ordinary. Serafina knew ballroom etiquette enough to know that it was the duty of every young gentleman to ask the young ladies of the ball to dance, and it was in fact rude for a gentleman to allow a young lady to stand for long without a partner. And for her part, if a young lady was properly and respectfully asked, she should not refuse to dance with a gentleman unless her dance card was already full. "My name is Braden Vanderbilt," he said in a kind but formal way as he put out his hand to her. "Will you do me the honor of dancing with me?" "With pleasure, sir," the girl replied in the sweetest, most exquisite Charleston accent that had ever been spoken by a Southern belle, and placed her delicate hand in his. Chapter 32. Serafina watched helplessly as Braden and Rowena walked slowly and formally out onto the dance floor among the other dancers. It was clear that he didn't recognize who she was, but he seemed strangely drawn to her. "Not her, Braden," Serafina shouted. "Anybody but her." Serafina tried to figure out what she could do to stop them. Could she create a blast of air to send all of the musicians' sheet music flying from their stands and halt the orchestra? Could she splash the water in the fountain onto all the dancers and send them running? Rowena leaned toward Braden and spoke to him in her lovely high society Southern accent. "I was so positively petrified by the thought that no one would ask me to dance this evening," she said, meeting his eyes with hers. "You are a fine gentleman for rescuing me." Rowena was acting so sickeningly sweet that it made Serafina want to scream her throat out. She knew that Rowena was trying to trick him, but she didn't understand her plan. And what was Braden thinking? Why was he doing this? He had no idea who this girl was. Was he going to dance hand in hand with every creature that slithered in and out of the forest in a nice dress and fancy hair? And with a brace on his leg, his dancing was going to be a painful, clumsy affair at best. But before Serafina knew it, the two of them faced each other in this ceremonial fashion. As was the custom, Braden put his white-gloved hands behind him and bowed deeply to his dance partner. When it was her turn, his lady did a slow, deep curtsy to him with one leg out in front of her, her head bowed, and her arms elevated beside her with the wings of a graceful swan. What on earth? Serafina thought. And then the two dance partners came together, holding each other in a formal and decorous fashion. Their dancing started out slow and easy, synchronized with the gentle overture of the orchestra's music and the movement of the other dancers. But when the waltz rose up to its full tempo, they began to move more swiftly, turn and turn and turn and dip, sweeping across the dance floor with astounding grace and beauty. It made Serafina's heart sink to watch it. She had no idea Braden knew how to dance like that. What amazed her even more was that he could move so smoothly and effortlessly with the brace on his leg. He normally dragged it along behind him, barely able to walk, but here he was gliding with the music of the waltz, like his feet barely touching the ground. Then Serafina looked down at his feet. It was difficult to detect, even for her narrow, suspicious eyes, but when she looked very carefully, she could see an unnatural glint beneath his feet. He wasn't dancing. The sorceress was pulling him along, literally sweeping him off of his feet with her power and deceit. But poor Braden had no idea. He was smiling, euphoric, happy to be dancing, moving with such strength and athleticism on his legs that had been weak and pathetic for so long. Serafina looked around at the other dancers and the people watching to see if any of them could see the sorcerer's work. Mrs. Vanderbilt looked on to the dancing couple with a smile on her face. Others, too, seemed to be pleased to see the two young dancers enjoying themselves. It was only Mr. Vanderbilt who appeared to be studying his nephew and his dancing partner with a very careful eye. There was neither happiness nor rejection in his expression, but a steady evaluation of what he was seeing, as if he sensed that something wasn't quite right. "It's because she's a sorceress," Serafina screamed. "Shh, cat," Rowena whispered as she and Braden danced, knowing that only Serafina could hear her through the sound of the music. A few moments later, when the music died down and the dance was over, Braden and his lady partner stood apart, faced each other once more. Braden bowed and his lady curtsied just as they had done before. Then Braden presented his right arm. His lady took it, and they walked off the floor. "Did you enjoy the dance?" Braden asked her. "Oh, yes, very much so. And you?" "Yes, my leg is feeling much better than it has in a long time," Braden said, his voice light and happy. Serafina followed them up the steps to the promenade that encircled the winter garden. The whole area was crowded with mingling guests. It was customary for the gentleman to escort his dancing partner back to her family or friends, but Braden did not appear to know where to take her. "I'm here alone," his lady partner said softly. "She doesn't have any friends," Serafina interjected, "and you definitely don't want to meet her family." "I see," Braden said uncertainly. "Would you like to partake of refreshments in the banquet hall?" "Yes, that would be delightful," she said, as they began walking in that direction. "Pardon for me asking," Braden said, "but have you been to the house on a previous occasion? Have I met you before?" "Yes, I believe we have met," she said mysteriously. Braden's expression changed. He leaned toward her and whispered, "Are you a catamount? Are you a friend of Wace's?" When the girl did not immediately reply, Braden asked, "Are you related to Serafina?" Then he looked down at her feet, knowing that some catamounts had 4 toes on each foot, even when they were in human form. Rowena's feet were covered by her glittering shoes, but at that moment, Serafina began to realize just how carefully Rowena had planned this out. From head to toe, she's all a trap. She's luring him right in. "I came to the ball tonight to speak with you, Braden," she said, her voice gentle and calm, but filled with just enough urgency to give it an edge. "With me?" Braden asked in surprise. "Perhaps we should go someplace more private," Rowena said. "Don't fall for her tricks, Braden," Serafina shouted at him, wondering if she could swirl her arms and start up a great wind inside the house to send Rowena's hair flying and knock her tumbling down the stairs to the basement. "All right," Braden said calmly. "Come this way." Rowena betrayed a crooked smile as she followed Braden through the banquet hall. The room was full of guests, many of them eating and drinking as they enjoyed the lively festivities of the ball. Serafina looked back through the archway toward the winter garden, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Vanderbilt watching Braden and Rowena from a distance, but she couldn't see him. "What are you doing, Braden?" Serafina asked. He seemed determined to slip away from the ball and get her alone. It was very unlike him. Serafina followed the two of them into the bachelor's wing and down the dark and empty passage. "Perhaps we could go in here," Braden suggested, gesturing toward the gunroom with its cabinets full of shotguns, hunting rifles, and other weapons. As was customary for gentlemen, Braden entered the darkroom first to find and turn on the light. "Rowena, I'm warning you, whatever you're doing, don't do it," Serafina said fiercely. "I mean it. Stop it." When Rowena ignored her, "When you were attacked, I helped you," Serafina reminded her. "Oh, don't fool yourself," Rowena whispered. "We both know that you're not all cotton balls and kitten paws. You helped me because it was the smart thing to do." "But what are you doing here?" Serafina demanded. "Leave Braden alone." "My plan should be clear to you now," Rowena said impatiently. "Pardon me?" Braden said, looking back at Rowena in confusion. "I was just saying that Biltmore must be a wonderful place to live," Rowena said more loudly, slipping back into her southern accent as she stepped into the room with Braden. Serafina followed her into the room. "The electric lamp isn't working for some reason, so I lit some of the candles," Braden explained. Serafina was surprised when Braden closed the door. It was highly improper for a young gentleman to lead a girl away from a formal ball into a dark private room and actually shut the door. The sights and sounds of the grand ball disappeared. The gunroom was a small and quiet place, the candlelight flickering on the dark woodwork all around and the glass cases filled with guns. Serafina noticed a table with a display of finely crafted hunting knives. She thought it was odd that one of the knives was missing. Mounted animal heads hung on the hunter green walls, and there was a small rustic fireplace in the corner glowing soft and warm with embers. "We can talk here," Braden said. As Rowena turned to him, it seemed as if she had lured Braden exactly to where she wanted him. She gazed into his eyes and moved closer to him. "The truth is," she said in a soft and vulnerable voice, "I need your help." She spoke the words with the most gentle, sweetest tone, and Serafina thought, "That's it. We're done for. We're lost. She's tricked him. We're all dead for sure." Braden looked at Rowena and said, "I'm not going to help you," as he pressed the point of a wickedly long, sharp hunting knife against the satin brocade of her dress, just where he could push it straight into her side. "I know who you are." Chapter 33. "Oh dear, you have a knife," Rowena said in her sweet Charleston accent, raising her hands, feigning dismay and confusion as she slowly backed up. "I don't understand. What's happening?" "I know who you are, Rowena," Braden said, holding the knife out in front of him, his hand trembling and his eyes wide with fear of facing down a sorceress who could throw a spell at him at any moment. "Braden, listen to me," Rowena said in her normal voice. "You can wear as many masks as you want, Rowena, but you're always a monster underneath." "I'm not going to hurt you," Rowena said, trying to calm him. "That's just what the cloak says," Braden shouted at her, pressing toward her with the knife in sudden panic, filled with more fear and agitation than Serafina had ever seen him in. "Don't kill her, Braden. We need her," Serafina shouted, but he couldn't hear her. "Please, let me explain," Rowena said, moving away from him as he pushed forward. "Then spit it out," he said, shaking the knife at her. "What are you doing here? What do you want?" "Tell him the truth or he's going to stab you," Serafina shouted frantically. "I came to tell you that my father is back and he's going to kill you and your family," Rowena said. Serafina sucked in a breath of surprise. That definitely wasn't the calm and reassuring explanation she was expecting. But then Rowena's words began to sink into Serafina's mind. She'd had her suspicions, but now she knew for sure. Uriah had come back. The storm creature she'd seen in the forest had been him. His talons and scaly skin, the remnants of his old owl form. The unhealed wounds across his face had been inflicted by her own panther claws. Uriah was the one bringing the storms, flooding the rivers and tearing away the trees. He had come to wreak his vengeance on Biltmore. "This is how you're trying to win my trust," Braden said, "by telling me that you and your father are going to kill me?" "I'm not going to wage my father's war anymore," Rowena said, her voice sharp. "I'm tired of the fighting and the blood and the endless cycle of hate and retribution." "Another lie," Braden said. "I know that I tricked you, I attacked you, I harmed you in so many ways, but I'm through with all of that." As Serafina listened to Rowena's words, everything began to make so much more sense. Uriah had been the one who had inflicted the terrible wounds on Rowena the night Wasa found her and helped her. Uriah had punished Rowena for failing to kill her that night and for losing the black cloak to their enemies. He was the one Rowena was hiding from in the bog, who had been threatening her, attacking her, the one she'd been screaming at the first time Serafina had come to her in spirit form. Serafina couldn't imagine what Rowena had been going through all this time. The girl had become a powerful sorceress in her own right, but it was clear that her father had been twisting her heart and her body for many years. He had a terrible grip on her, and probably always had. Serafina couldn't even imagine her own pa doing that. It was threat, it was hurt, it was 1,000 things, but it was not love. "Then why have you come?" Braden demanded. "I need the black cloak," Rowena said. "I don't have it," Braden spat back. What surprised Serafina wasn't Rowena's trickery or Braden's fierceness, but the fact that Rowena hadn't thrown a potion, cast a spell, or tried to outright kill him. So far, she had not only refrained from attacking him, she had told the truth. This was the weariness, the loneliness that Serafina had seen in her before. "Much has changed," Rowena had said. Serafina realized now that she'd been talking about herself. "You said that you don't want to hurt anyone," Braden said, "but you want the black cloak. That doesn't make sense." "I'm trying to help you, Braden," Rowena said, and even to Serafina's suspicious ear, it sounded strangely sincere. Rowena seemed to truly care for him. "Help me?" Brayden snapped at her in disgust. "You killed Serafina!" Brayden screamed the words with such powerful emotion that it broke Serafina's heart. All the fighting and deception between them, but this was the offense that he could not forgive. "You killed Serafina." The words were so final, so devastating to him. She realized now how deeply his heart had been damaged. For as long as she had known him, he had always been the trusting one. He had defended his friend, Mr. Thorne. He had trusted Lady Rowena when she came to Biltmore. He had always been the person to open his arms to someone new. And Serafina knew that she had always been the suspicious one, the one who didn't trust people. She had suspected Mr. Vanderbilt was the man in the black cloak because of the type of shoes he wore. She had suspected the footman, Mr. Pratt, and the coachman, Mr. Crankshot, and the detective, Mr. Grayson, and all the others. She was always hunting for the rat. But now she realized that she had changed too. Maybe just as much as Brayden had, but in the opposite direction. She could feel herself starting to listen to Rowena, wanting to believe what she was saying. She had seen Rowena that first night in the forest, walking alone by the river, her spirit so changed. And she had heard the fear in the girl's voice when she shouted out into the darkened forest. And she had seen Rowena fighting off her father's attack, screaming at him in savage defiance. Could all of this have been an elaborate trick designed to gain her trust? Serafina knew it could be, but it felt like Rowena was telling the truth. But more than all that, Serafina knew that it didn't matter how scared she was, how uncertain or suspicious she needed Rowena. If Rowena didn't succeed tonight, Uriah was going to kill Brayden. That much was certain. But here was Brayden on the opposite side of it. He hated Rowena. Rowena had harmed him, scarred him, and killed his friend. Serafina tried to think, what could she do? How could she talk to Brayden? How could she show him that she was here? She looked around the softly lit room, the guns in the glass cases, the sizzling embers and gray ashes in the fireplace, the upholstered chairs and the wooden table, and the Persian rug on the floor. She could see Brayden and Rowena's reflection in the glass, but she couldn't see her own. She was just a glint of light in the glass. Then she looked at the fireplace again. Ashes to ashes, she thought, as an idea sprang into her mind. "Rowena, listen to me," she said. "We need to get Brayden's attention. Get him over to the fireplace." Rowena didn't seem to understand and didn't respond. "Do what I say," Serafina demanded. "He's never going to listen to you alone. Not like this. You need my help." As she watched Rowena pause and think it through, she realized that even the sorceress had to be careful about whom she trusted. "Brayden," Rowena finally said, "I need to show you something by the fireplace." "Good, that's perfect," Serafina encouraged her. "Just get him over there and I'll do the rest." "No," Brayden said, pointing the knife at her. "It's about Serafina," Rowena said. "What about her?" "Come over to the fireplace and I'll show you." "I'm not going to do what you say," Brayden said. "You've got to convince him," Serafina told her. "He's not going to do it," Rowena said. "Who are you talking to?" Brayden asked her. "Find a way," Serafina said. "Act harmless. Lay on the floor." "I'm not stupid," Rowena said. "I'm not doing that." "You're not doing what?" Brayden demanded. "Get on the floor," Serafina said again. "If I'm going to trust you, you need to trust me." "Fine," Rowena snapped resentfully, but then she spoke to Brayden in a softer, gentler voice. "Brayden, I understand that you're frightened of me. I would be too if I were you. So let me do this. I will not resist you. Hold your knife to me so that I cannot harm you." Watching the sorceress carefully, Brayden moved the knife toward her. Rowena slowly lowered herself and lay flat on her back in front of the fireplace. Brayden followed her down, kneeling beside her, and pressed the blade against her throat. "Your move, cat," Rowena said. "What are you saying?" Brayden asked. "Now ask him to blow into the ashes," Serafina said. "Brayden," Rowena said, "I need to show you something that I know is important to you. I will not move in any way. I want you to blow into the ashes of the fireplace as hard as you can." "Who are you talking to?" Brayden asked. "I'll show you," Rowena said. Brayden stared at her malevolently, then finally sucked in a deep breath and blew into the ashes. The ashes and the glowing embers went flying up in a great swirling cloud into the room. "That's perfect," Serafina cheered. As the embers and the ashes floated down, she moved her hands back and forth through the air, guiding the way they fell. Filling her lungs, she blew here and she blew there, bringing new life to the glow of the embers and pushing the ashes up into curling, floating motion until they all began to fall into tiny lines onto the hardwood floor. "What's happening?" Braden asked, his voice trembling with the mystery of what he was seeing. Serafina guided the ashes and embers down until they fell together into small, scratchy, glowing lines. I-T-S-M-E. "What is that?" Braden asked in fascination. "Does it spell something?" He leaned towards the glowing ashes and tried to make out the rough letters in the faint, flickering light of the candles. I-T-S-M-E, Braden said as he deciphered the letters one by one. "It says it's me. But who is it? Who's me?" "Well, you definitely have his attention now," Rowena said as she sat up. "Who are you talking to?" Braden asked again. "The answer to all your questions is the same, Braden." "What?" Braden asked in frustration. "It's Serafina," Rowena said. "What do you mean it's Serafina?" "Serafina is here." "Here?" "She's here now, in this room with us." "You're lying," Braden said. "You're a nasty liar." Angry and disgusted, Braden blew the ashes away contemptuously, as if to say, "I don't believe a word of this." The ashes and the flaring embers swirled up into the air and floated around the room. Over the next few moments, they should have gone dark and fallen randomly onto the floor and furniture, but Serafina moved her hands and blew with her lungs and brought them right back down to the floor where they had been before, glowing with new life. Trusther. Braden gazed in wonderment at the letters, but then he caught himself. "Oh, stop it," he said. "This is just more of your tricks." "It's the cat," Rowena said flatly. "No, it isn't. Serafina's dead. I buried her myself." "I thought she was too, but we both were wrong. She's not totally dead. Serafina's spirit is in this ring." "Just stop this," Braden screamed at her, his voice shaking with indignation as the two of them got to their feet and faced each other. "You're always lying." "But she's here," Rowena said. "How do I know that you're not lying to me like you have so many times before? If she's truly here, then prove it to me." "Rowena," Serafina said, "tell him to ask you something that only Serafina would know." When Rowena said these words, Braden's expression changed. He thought for several seconds, then narrowed his eyes suspiciously at her. "What were the first words I ever spoke to Serafina?" Serafina thought back. What were the first words he'd ever said to her? She tried to think. It was the morning after she'd seen the black cloak for the first time. She had just crept upstairs into the daylight. "Are you lost?" Serafina said. "That's what he said." "Are you lost?" Rowena said. Braden's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, he almost believed her, but then he remembered who he was dealing with, and he became distrustful and angry again. "It's a trick," he said. "I'll do another. The second time I saw Serafina, I came upon Mr. Crankshawd shaking the living daylights out of her. What did she pretend she was?" Serafina smiled. This one was easy. "A shoeshine girl." "We pretended I was the shoeshine girl," Rowena said, not just repeating Serafina's words, but taking on the exact sound of her voice, allowing Serafina's spirit to speak through her. Hearing Serafina's voice, Braden gazed around the room in shocked amazement. "Serafina is in this room at this very moment," Rowena said to him softly in her own voice. "She arranged those letters in the ash. She's asking you to trust me." "But how are you able to do this?" Braden asked. "A wise man once said, 'That which does not destroy us makes us stronger.'" "I don't understand," Braden said. "After you and the two cats struck me down during the battle for the Twisted Staff, it took time, but I came back, and I was stronger than ever. I'm not just a sorceress now. I'm a necromancer." "What is that?" "I can sometimes speak to the spirits of the dead and the in-between." Braden stared at her in dread, clearly not sure if he should believe her. "I want to do another test," he said. This time, he spoke to the room, like people do when they speak to ghosts at a seance. "Serafina, if you're here, I once gave you a gift, long and red." Serafina thought back. A gift, long and red. What had he given her? The red dress, Serafina said excitedly, and Rowena repeated it in her voice. This is amazing, Brayden said, spellbound by the sound of Serafina's voice. And when was the first time you wore it? I used it to trap the man in the black cloak, Serafina said, and Rowena repeated the words with haunting emotion. The morning I brought the children back home, I was standing at the forest edge with Gideon on one side and my mother in lion form on the other. I saw you up on your horse as you gathered a search party to look for me. And you looked so fierce and beautiful standing there at the edge of the forest in your torn dress, Brayden remembered. Hearing her friend's words and feeling the ache in his heart in her own, Serafina began to cry. Oh, please, you're not beautiful. You're a cat, Rowena snapped. He likes cats. That's all it is. Now do get a hold of yourself, or this whole thing isn't going to work. Serafina wiped her eyes and toughened herself, knowing that Rowena was right. Look, Serafina said to Rowena sharply, if I ask Brayden to give you the black cloak, what are you going to do with it? What is your plan? You may be fast with your claws, but you sure are slow with the rest of it, Rowena said in a scathing tone. Have you been following along at all?